I'd like to formally welcome you all to this session on construction design and technology. We have 3 papers being presented this afternoon. The first on on-site communication, migrant workers and informal interpreters. The second is on project cost overruns and risk allocation in public funded projects in Malaysia. And the third one is the role of risk attitudes, discrepancies between human and computer-based risk analysis in the utility sector. So we'll take each presentation in turn and there'll be opportunities for Q&A after each one.
This comes from my PhD project at the University of Reading, which is supervised by Dr. Florence Phua and Dr. Tutt, and funded by the EPSRC. So first, some context about interlingual communication on site. Migrant workers are used internationally on construction sites, and this combination of speakers of different languages can cause difficulties for safety, relations, and works. These are managed in a variety of ways, including using pictorial signs, language learning, providing safety training in other languages, and written translations, and a number of other small initiatives. But all of this leaves the gap of spoken communication every day on site, and this is filled by the informal interpreter. That's a bilingual worker who facilitates communication between the different languages they speak. That leads to my 2 guiding research questions. Firstly, who are the informal interpreters? So this looks beyond their position at work to their identities, their reasons for migration, their reasons for doing the language work, etc. And question 2 is, how do they facilitate communication? So an ethnographic approach was taken. This included 40 interviews with a number of different participants, such as health and safety managers, project managers, supervisors, labourers, and professional interpreters. Observations on 3 sites here in the UK, and a collection of photos and documents. The data was analysed using a theoretical framework based on an identity and language approach. So this approach views identities as being complex, multiple, and changing, and specifically as being negotiated through language and adjusted in migration. This comes from the field of second language acquisition, and regarding research question 1, who are the informal interpreters, there are 2 constructs which are particularly useful. Imagined communities and investment. So imagined communities are those which language learners or users desire to become a part of because they perceive that these communities can give them greater economic or social mobility. And relatedly, investment signals that the relationship of learners or users to the target language is based on an understanding that they will. From my PhD project at the University of Reading, which is supervised by Dr. Florence Phua and Dr. Tutt, and funded by the EPSRC. So first, some context about interlingual communication on site. Migrant workers are used internationally on construction sites, and this combination of speakers of different languages can cause difficulties for safety, relations, and works. These are managed in a variety of ways, including using pictorial signs, language learning, providing safety training in other languages, and include more than 1 language, and this helps to understand actual communication practices more holistically, avoid judgment of right and wrong language use, and see that moments of interpretation, the direct language transfer, occur within a more diverse interactional environment. So now the findings. First, those related to research question 1, and who are the informal interpreters? So often the supervisor, as found in previous research, but there may also be other people doing this role, as well as sub-interpreters. So, for example, in the data there are project managers, assistant site managers, and other workers who sometimes take on language work. The difference is that the kind of principal informal interpreter is needed in formal interactional moments like induction and toolbox talks, and the sub-interpreters are needed either when they're not there or in the ongoing task communication, especially in teams where there are more than 2 languages spoken. It was found that there are very split attitudes on the language work by the part of those who are doing it. For example, one participant said, "I'm proud of the situation," whereas others were simply not interested in it and did it begrudgingly. One participant said, "Somebody else had the title and I was doing the job." There is also a relationship between language work and identity. So the interpretation work of participants with most developed bilingual skills extended to a role in facilitating good relations on site. This included mediating tensions and sometimes explaining cultural differences, whereas other informal interpreters did the minimum language work required of them, and bilingualism was not a salient part of their identity. For some, investing in language skills improved their job and social prospects. So for many this happened perhaps incidentally, but for some it was actively pursued. For example, one Mexican participant said, "I wanted to be able to do better in life, so I start learning the language." And indeed, he managed to progress his career through this means. So there's a link between language work and employment, although this was always informal. It was not in a contract and was not recognised in a job title. For example, one Portuguese worker said, "I passed directly to responsible of everybody. Why? Because I knew how to communicate in the language that was needed." Similarly, a British man working in construction in Germany, who had informal interpreting experience there, then moved on to become a language teacher and finally a professional interpreter here in the UK. Of the informal interpreting experience, he said, "It was kind of a baptism by fire. I think it stood me in good stead because I ended up, going back to that." So now those findings related to research question 2, how they facilitate the communication. So is it interpretation? Not strictly speaking, because the information is usually passed on in a different time and place, and often in more diverse means than just a verbal transmission. So we can consider them to be moments of interpretation or translation in a translanguaging space, so in a much more complex and creative interactional environment. And the work ranges, like I said, from language transfer in key moments to mediation. But this may also include, for some of them, having to teach language, do written translations, and perhaps to communicate with external parties. So we can see that the position, the work that they do is very varied. Both the professional and the informal interpreters discussed this mediation part of the work. One said, "A cultural adaptation is the key also." And another, "It's not about the language, to speak the language, but to be able to communicate. Communication is empathy." So communication strategies used by many included simplification of the message, paraphrasing, drawing, using body language and gesture, photos, and translation apps. About the drawing, one worker said, "I bring the drawing out. I point them where is our clash. I draw on top of the drawing." So it's the act of drawing, not only using drawings themselves. And the importance of translation technology was demonstrated in this quote, "Google Translate is my best friend." Difficulties found by many included accents, the use of jargon and acronyms, and specifically videos and documents which ended up always being summarized because it was impossible for them to interpret all of the content as untrained people that were unprepared for the task. So why does all this matter? Well, time was lost through sometimes having to redo work and always having to double-check that things had been understood. There was atmosphere of concern about communication, mistrust about what the informal interpreter was really doing, and frustration and tension created by miscommunication. There were also 2 examples of accidents in the data that had relation with this misunderstanding because of language. And as communication skills are not rewarded on site, they risk being lost here. So there's a possible trend, it seems, of those informal interpreting not having the most developed skills in this, and therefore performing this reduced scope of the language task. Therefore, the conclusion is, recognizing and maximizing the potential of this language work can help retain and build on these skills. It may also increase productivity, improve relations, and reduce risks. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm happy to take some Q&A in the text box.
Just like to ask if it might be easier to just ask the question directly rather than typing, because I'm conscious that we're running out of time.
Should I go ahead and answer the questions from the chat?
The internet just dropped off. Now we're back online again. Apologies for that. A really interesting presentation, and if you haven't already read the paper, I do suggest that you do so. I'm just keen to find out a little bit from yourself in terms of informal interpreters, where the idea actually came from. Was this something you've observed with being on sites in the past, and you thought it would be quite interesting to explore?
So the idea was already in quite a few different research papers, but it's been kind of named quite a lot of different things. So sometimes translator, interpreter, language broker, or sometimes kind of not given a title. So the position was already recognized in quite a lot of research papers. So just to then extend on that research.
So it was interesting as well in the paper that you kind of give a balanced argument. There are clear benefits and there's some drawbacks as well of informal interpreters. What do you see as the biggest challenge? I know there's a few, and I know you'd mentioned some just in the conclusions there in the presentation, but is there anything from the research that really did stand out?
I would say the biggest challenge in terms of trying to move forward and maybe formalize the role is kind of the nature of employment and teams changing and people moving on. In terms of the role itself, beyond the very obvious does that person simply understand and speak enough of the two languages involved? The most difficult scenarios that came up would have been a couple of times that there were accidents which require a different type of interpretation. So just cutting to the point, not actually trying to convey everything. In the medical scenarios, it can also require vocabulary that most of us wouldn't automatically know. And it's also a very emotionally challenging part of this work, which professional interpreters are trained to deal with to some extent, but these informal interpreters aren't. So that would be one of the biggest challenges. And then, yeah, all of the other difficulties I mentioned about accents and things like that. It's endless.
Yeah, I don't want to keep the conversation to myself. I will take questions from others in a moment, but I really was very intrigued by the research, and it really is something quite different and really interesting. My final question was in terms of retention of informal interpreters. I think you'd mentioned in the paper of, people moving on to different sectors and moving out of construction, and this idea of retention, and whether or not there was any recommendations that you came across on how to retain individuals, clearly doing a very important role. So it was just to get your views and some thoughts on that.
So some of the tensions which I found and has also been noted in previous research was those who had more developed bilingual skills, feeling that those were being taken advantage of, and why were they taking on what is quite a big extra responsibility for often no extra pay or any other benefit. So one of the solutions, I think, would be naming it as a position, and preferably giving extra pay for that as well, and recognition. And that's important not only for recognizing and retaining those skills, but what's in the paper is that it seems that quite often having language skills is a significant reason why someone gets promoted, but that's fine if they're also kind of the original person that would be chosen to take on that position, but maybe they're not. So if you could have someone that was in this informal interpreter role helping out, who really is in the position of supervisor, for example, then it could have a big impact on the progress of works and the relations more widely as well.
Yeah, and I think that leads on nicely to one of the questions there. You mentioned knowledge transfer loss, and I suppose, do you know the impact of this transfer loss, and is that something that maybe in the future you'll be able to measure to some degree, if you like, the impact that might have on performance on the site for those involved? It was just a question that came up there in the Q&A box.
Yeah, thank you. That's something that when I was designing the project that I wanted to look at, and then it became clear that I couldn't see any way of quantifying that. Yeah, but it came up in, I think, every interview, that time was lost because of that, and then in the more extreme cases, sort of accidents and things as well. So.
Yeah, and I think obviously the big thing as well, it seems to be coming out from some of the question, is this link with communication and feeling, that there is clear communication channels and workers' mental health problems, and there's the technical side of transferring information, but there's that sociable element as well, and it's really looking at the mental health problems, and I'm assuming that those are some of the main points as well that were included, that came out of the research.
I didn't probe any mental health issues specifically in any questioning or anything like that, although I think that's a really interesting, potential future way that it could go. But one area that would be very clearly be related to mental health is the feeling of sort of isolation that comes from not being able to understand anything, and that's quite clear to anyone, I think. But when I was on site, it happened a few times that someone kind of interpreted for me what someone else was saying, and I was left thinking, God, if I had to rely on this person for everything that I needed to ask, or I needed to get help or something, and you're quite vulnerable then. So I don't have any data specifically on it, but I'm sure there's a link there. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, really, really good. Thank you so much for that. We do appreciate. I could probably talk to you all day on this, and I might chat to you later on, because I think there's a lot to the research, and it is a really interesting paper. And thanks so much for the presentation as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So hopefully we won't have any more technical difficulties, everyone. Hopefully I won't get kicked back out of the system. We'll move on now to presentation number 2. There we are, and it's on project cost overruns and risk allocation in public funded projects in Malaysia.
Hello everyone, my name is Farah Shahrin. I would like to present you our research with the title Project Cost Overruns and Risk Allocation in Public Funded Project in Malaysia. This research is a collaborative work between me, Kamarul Mahmud and Fadhil Hassan. The construction professionals are much more under pressure to deliver better project performance to achieve better value for money. The usual targets are the time, cost and quality now include more emphasis towards sustainability and better impact to the public. However, we have few other issues that we need to consider. For example, we have issues with clarity with expectation, unmanageable communication because we have different level of clients and their team members, ever-changing needs with very restricted fundings, and stakeholders and users' needs that change over the time. According to the report called Completing Crossrail, in 2019, one of the recommendations is to manage the program to be more deliverable and prudent. Another suggestion is to consider the complexity of the client requirement with their multi-layered client organization, which all this could give effect to the cost control. Another issue such as changes in design, scope and specification, which also affect the cost performance. Many developed countries are now pushing towards zero emission agenda, while many developing and developed countries are facing unprecedented struggles to rise back due to the issue of health, economic and social impact, especially during this pandemic period. It has to be acknowledged that the resources are always remain scarce and constrained, but one of the ways is to reduce or cut down the error, which reduce the waste and inefficiency in our working process in order to create value. One of the major issues that we face in construction processes is the data availability, an issue with transparency that will affect the certainty in decision making. Another major point is our ability to respond to change. It has to be clear that clients and organizations can be quite challenging in terms of separate entities with different set of needs. There are a few papers that talk about the experience where the uncertainty needs time, and with having more experience with the client or having the similar project done, it would certainly help in terms of building the organization's knowledge. it's important to let you know that this is part of the larger research. This is the first stage of the research, which we aim to identify the main causes of the cost overruns by auditing the project final account statement. The overall research question is to determine whether we are operating within the right guidelines by managing the cost through identification of project risk to the agreed cost, time and quality. We also wanted to know what do we know from the analysis of the issues and the factors contributing to the overruns. Our research methods at the beginning of the research is the quantitative data analysis of the projects and the interviews with the project professionals. The aim of the interview is to get a clearer picture of the factors leading to cost overruns and their impact towards the project. This would support the understanding of client and the project team risk appetite in managing costs and their risk. This also aims to triangulate the analysis from the official data provided by the client. However, after numerous attempts, it is very difficult to actually get in touch and get hold of the project professional due to the lockdown, as most of them, actually all of them, are working from home and they are struggling to be interviewed for this data collection at this point when we're conducting the research. So due to that issue, we have to kind of like change the scope of the research by changing the research aim to identify what are the main causes of the cost overruns by auditing the project final account statement. So we started off with 34 projects. Okay, so we do have some selection criteria. So the criteria of the projects, they must have a detailed record, including the evidence of the causes of the overruns, including the cost breakdowns, claim certificates, and the variation order. It is very important to have all these documents and evidence so that we are able to identify the issues and to understand the cost impact of the issues, such as the delay and other social implications. For example, there are projects with school which can affect the opening day for the school, delay opening, access to the road closure, and hopefully by having all this information, it would supplement the missing context of the interview that we're missing from this study.
Okay, many thanks for that. Hopefully we've got Farah in the audience at the moment, and I think we missed a little bit of the audio towards the end there of your presentation. That's not a problem. Maybe you could summarise some of the main findings for us. It's interesting when you read the paper. Again, another really interesting topic on project cost overruns. I suppose for me, I'm keen to understand the differences between your research and maybe other work in this area, given that the topic has been covered, numerous times. So since we missed the conclusions, it might be worth just, if you could, telling us a little bit about the main findings and how they differ perhaps to previous studies, if you can, Farah.
Hello, Nicola. Hello, everyone. I think the main findings I would like to share with everyone today is the absence of transparency first, absence of transparency for the overhead and profit submitted from main contractor to the client. Secondly is the absence of proper categorization of risk. So that is something that, even though I work in Malaysia before, this is something that I try to pursue, because I try to create much more transparency in terms of the cost management. So I think I was, as I explained in the paper, this is the public projects. So client actually have quite a good amount of money, and I think it's very much important if the money are also being used for other better impact, especially for the social economic impact, rather than being used for something that can be avoided. So one of the main findings I found out is the overruns are normally recurring issues due to the data availability or data communication, because of missing communication, and this could have been avoided if a better thorough investigation has been done much earlier. Another issue is which more become a question, is if the project are being selected based on a traditional procurement where the main contractor submitted a proper detailed bills and quantities, why do there's an issue about scope of the projects? Why is it most of the project has to be reduced in terms of the scope in order to meet the target for the costing? Because when you reduce the scope, meaning that you will reduce the quality that you intended to give to the public. So this is, as I said, this is the beginning, the early part of the research. Our target is to actually look down on more research and try to categorize what are the main recurring issues and try to attach the risk and quantify the risk. So it's more about like a project auditing.
Okay, so do you have a plan for that going forward? Or just to get an idea of the scope of the research, are you going to look at multiple projects in the future and again bring them together to assess? Yeah, so, I suppose one of the biggest challenges with doing that is each individual project is somewhat unique, and obviously, you know, difficulties for one and challenges and risks to overcome will vary from project to project, but likewise there will be overlaps. And in terms of the output of the research further down the line, what do you imagine that to look like? Is there going to be, you know, a framework of some form or some recommendations for the sector, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, our main target is to kind of like make a suggestion towards the changes in terms of their policy for their cost management. Because what we're looking at today, 34 projects at the beginning, are all within the same category within one state by one client. So they're all similar projects. They're all recreational projects within quite similar gross floor area. So we try to group similar projects with kind of like similar characteristic. So the next step forward, which is supposed to be done during this summer, is to kind of like categorize the risk, quantify the risk, and try to see what are the root causes. Mainly, the main challenges is to track down the professionals, and because of the time difference and the working from home capacity, it's quite challenging. But once everything back to normal, I'm sure it is something that I'm very interested to find out more.
Yeah, I'm sure many people here will be able to relate to the challenges posed by COVID, particularly when trying to carry out some research. So many thanks for that. I'm not sure if there was any questions in the chat box, but please do feel free to pop some comments or questions there. I'm sure Farah will be around for the next few moments, and we can certainly have a bit more of a chat if some questions come through. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much for
that presentation. Really good paper again. So I would encourage you to have a good read if you've not already done so.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And we will move on to our final paper of this session. And it's looking at the role of risk attitudes, and more specifically the discrepancies between human and computer-based risk analysis. And again, looking very focused in the utility sector. Okay.
Welcome everybody. My name is Huurne and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Twente. I work at the Department of Construction Management and Engineering. And today I will briefly talk you through my paper, which is called The Role of Risk Attitudes, Discrepancies between Human and Computer-Based Risk Analysis in the Utility Sector. As we all know, the construction industry is exposed to high levels of various types of risks. Organizations in the industry are continuously confronted with situations that may involve many unknown, unexpected, undesirable, or unpredictable factors. Due to the complexity and the types of risk associated to construction projects and their activities, risk management has become a central topic of discussion in construction management literature. Risk management can be defined as the process of identifying, analyzing, and assessing the risk the construction project is exposed to, so that a conscious decision can be taken on how to handle these risks. Yet, to make that conscious decision, we know that decision makers are often bounded by rationality, meaning that suboptimal decision making may happen. One sector in particular that deals with risks on a daily basis is the utility sector. So utilities concern the complex and vast networks of cables and pipes that are responsible for transporting water, gas, electricity, telecommunication, sewage, heating and other services. Since many of the utilities are buried in the ground, the whereabouts of utilities are typically unseen from the surface. And therefore, construction activities with or nearby utilities face the risk of damaging utilities in case they need to do some kind of excavation activities. To manage the risk of excavation damage, one needs to know where the utilities are located. Therefore, utilities are typically exposed via so-called trial trenches to visually inspect the utilities' whereabouts. As you can see on the slide, a trial trench has also one big problem, and that is that they only provide a local measure at the point where the trench is dug. This means an understanding is required about the involved risks at the construction site to make a conscious decision on where to locate the specific trial trench. The complexity of the buried utilities in combination with the uncertainty about their whereabouts makes utility locating, and therefore effectively managing the risk on excavation damages as well, a highly challenging task. Yet, to date, this task heavily relies on human decision making. Despite the actions taken to prevent excavation damages from happening, they are unfortunately still commonplace. And to illustrate that, in 2019, over 453,000 damages were reported in the United States and over 40,000 in the Netherlands. And these damages do not only interrupt the utility service, but they also contribute to project delays, road closures, environmental damages, but even non-fatal and fatal accidents. So we know that a root cause of excavation damage is known to be the insufficient utility locating before excavation activities. So we could also argue that the current way of employing the trial trench method is questionable. And how effective is the method actually in managing the risk on excavation damages? To answer that question, I assessed the current risk management approach against the risk management framework that entails 4 risk management phases. And these phases are risk identification, risk classification, risk analysis, and risk response. The entire process of risk management is thereby influenced by the attitude of the decision maker in this case, because it still relies on human decision making, and this impacts the entire risk management process. In addition to human decision making, current digitization efforts in the construction industry shape, however, new opportunities to use computer-based tools instead, and they can help and support the risk management process and lessen human error. And computer-based tools are considered to be superior to conventional human decision making because they are capable of dealing with dynamic and uncertain environments better than human beings. Rather surprising, the use of these tools is seemingly marginalized in the uncertainty-fed utility locating practice. So, in this study, I explored the risk management process behind trial trench locations in the Dutch utility sector by studying how human-based risk management forms risk responses and to explicate the effectiveness of human-based risk management when compared to the outcomes of computer-based risk management. I therefore conducted a qualitative comparative case study in which I studied 3 utility locating cases in the Dutch utility sector. I collected data by observing the trial trench method in practice, and I conducted interviews with the decision makers behind the trial trench locations. During the observation in practice, I also had unstructured dialogues with the practitioners on site, who provided me with additional clarifications of the actions observed and performed. I then analyzed the data via a 2-stage process. First, the risk management framework adopted from Flanagan and Norman was used as a conceptual framework to understand and explicate the risk management rationale behind the trial trench method. Second, I compared the outcomes of a computer-based risk tool with the locations of the trial trenches as depicted by the human decision makers. The computer-based tool used in this study is a continuation of the work of Raj. The tool calculates excavation damage risk scores based upon multiple parameters such as the utility type, the utility material, the type of planned construction activities, and the type of area the activities are planned in. The risk is then calculated by multiplying the probability of damaging the utilities with the consequences of the damage. Outcomes of the tool were then compared with where human decision makers locate trial trenches to be able to highlight differences and similarities. Reflecting the studied risk management process against the risk management framework gave some interesting findings. In terms of risk identification, it was found that the main source of the risk is the often incompleteness and unreliability of the utility maps. Interestingly, however, is that for all cases, the risk identified is the potential physical clash between the design of new cables and pipes with the whereabouts of the existing cables and pipes at the site. The risk of damaging utilities was not even mentioned. Regarding the risk classification, if the design clashes with the in-situ situation, it was explained that this typically leads to huge project delays and vast additional expenditures. Practice wanted that to be prevented, of course. In terms of risk analysis, both the observations and interviews did not show any type of expressed analytic behavior. Practitioners used their intuition and expertise to determine the risk-prone locations. No formalized or quantitative assessments were done to estimate the consequences of damaged utilities. As a risk response, trial trenches were dug at so-called bottlenecks. An example of such a bottleneck is where the new utility crosses the existing utilities. Furthermore, practitioners mentioned that the quantity of trial trench locations was greatly impacted by the available time and budget of the construction project. When compared to the risk responses of the computer-based tool, 2 differences are noted. First, the number of trial trenches is remarkably fewer. This means that many risk-prone locations were not investigated in practice. At the same time, the location of trenches occasionally does not align with where the risks are the greatest, as suggested by the computer-based tool. And even more interesting is that often subtle differences in location exist, where the tool suggests a trial trench location just a few meters from the spot where the actual trench was dug in practice. Arriving at the discussion. I could say that this study has shown to date that prevention of excavation damages, however, does not seem to be the main driver for practice. We could say that a shift in risk attitude by practice is likely required first before the utility sector could see a real decline in the number of excavation damages. Also, the utility sector is lagging in terms of the use of computer-based risk management tools, instead relying on intuition and expertise-based risk management. Yet in the current day and age, this way of managing the risk to excavation damage is arguably not effective enough anymore when we compare those outcomes with the outcomes of the computer-based risk management tool. In conclusion, this study has showed that locations of trenches are chosen based on the intuition and expertise of the decision maker. It was demonstrated that the effectiveness of the current risk management approach is questionable, since in comparison with the computer-based tool, the method leads to a vastly lower number of locations to be investigated, and locations do often not align with where the risks to excavation damage are the greatest. Arguably, computer-based risk management tools may help in assisting practitioners with deciding on where to dig trial trenches. Findings also demonstrated a risk attitude that is not primarily focused on reducing excavation damages. Whereas computer-based risk tools may help in positioning trial trench locations, a shift in risk attitude by practice is required first. We could say that a mindset of careful excavation amongst the practice community is key. Thank you all for listening. If you are interested in this study, please have a look at my paper, of course. If there are any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Excellent, many thanks. And I'm sure you'll agree that, again, another really interesting paper, looking very specifically at the utility sector and the differences between humans versus computer-based analysis. Really interesting to see the differences between the two. So if you do have some questions, I know, Florence, if you do have a question, feel free to ask now.
Hi, hello. Thank you for an interesting presentation, Ramon. I am sort of wondering whether or not you consider the risk attitudes of individuals when they look at these things, because I've done some work on the risk-taking individuals. They're more attracted to construction. I've written papers on it, and I also have found that generally, I think individuals who end up in the construction industry have a higher risk-taking profile than other industries. So than other individuals in other industries. So I'm sort of wondering if maybe some of your work could be controlled for and compared with other industries, because the nature of the industry. By default, I don't know why, attracts high risk-taking individuals for some reason. so that's perhaps something to look into, just as a suggestion, because my own work has shown that, and it's an interesting finding. I thought that could help maybe explain some of the risk attitude and behavior of your participants, maybe.
Yes, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for your comment on that. I think that's indeed the case for the architecture and engineering industry, or the construction industry. Some of the practitioners also explained that because of just the short-term nature of the industry, having constraints in time and budget, that they often just choose for the fastest and the cheapest way to do the work, not necessarily managing the risks to the highest degree, because they're not capable to do so within the constraints of the project, or within the budget and time limits of the project. So I think that is potentially a main contributor to that risk attitude that I've observed, which also may be indeed a difference to other industries, where this short-term fragmented nature is not that much of a thing.
Okay, thanks Florence for the question, and thanks Ramon for that. We do have another question from Tom, who is just asking about the analysis in terms of the cases that you studied. Is the decision making fully delegated to the computer, or are humans as decision makers informed by the computer models? So, which comes first? Is it the delegation first, or is it humans make the decisions that's informed by the computer models?
Yeah, so perhaps I should explain something about the tool indeed. So this tool basically calculates risk scores. So the risk is then the risk on excavation damage, and there's a certain threshold that was determined by experts in the past that determines whether the risk is high enough to basically validate that there is a trench needed. So the tool by itself then generates like a map on where to dig the trenches, or what the high risk locations are. So there's not like an intervention, like a human intervention in the meantime. The tool gives that as an output, so to say.
Okay, and I think we've got a few more comments coming through. Tom's just saying that's a clear answer, so you answered that well. In terms of the overall kind of recommendations, if you like, to summarise the paper, you know, recommendations for the utility sector. Was there anything that came out that you want to share with our attendees?
Yeah, I think the ambition generally in the utility sector is that decreasing, or there is a shared ambition that, you know, excavation damages should be decreased. You know, I think it's not only in the Netherlands but worldwide. There are several incentives that try to achieve that. But then there also should be some kind of a shared mindset also amongst the practice community, because I don't think now that the industry is really providing practitioners the availability to do proper research in advance of these excavation activities. So I think that is an important thing. I think that should change before we could see some real decline in excavation damages. I think prior to excavation activities, it's just very important to do proper research, and there's just not always the time and budget for that now.
Excellent, yeah, and Farah's saying that she also faced some findings similar in terms of her data in relation to overruns with earthworks and substructure work and things. So there's certainly a lot of overlap between the three papers in terms of the risks associated with construction. So it's interesting when you see all three together. So many thanks for your input. Many thanks for your contribution. And again, just to highlight to everyone, you know, as I said before, please do go on and check out the paper in more detail. And I'm sure people will be in touch if there's similarities between the work that could be explored, then by all means. But thanks for that. Yeah,
I think there's one question as well from Leo that is still there. Perhaps.
Oh, did it come
if there's time or.
What was the final question there?
Leon asked, did the use of the system itself create more awareness or different attitudes of the operators? So I guess, so the system was basically used or tested in more separate fashion to what the practitioners in practice did. So there should be more like I think a kind of, the tool couldn't be used as a risk awareness method to raise awareness amongst practitioners, but that was not done within this study so far. So that could indeed be a next step to see how actually
certainly
practitioners react. Yeah.
Maybe a phase 2.
Indeed, yes.
Excellent. No, that's really useful. Thanks so much for your questions and your responses there. To all three of our presenters. I'll let the chat run just in the meantime, but I think that does draw the session pretty much to a close. I'd like to apologise once again for the slight technical glitches that we had. We are on time though, which takes us quite nicely into the kind of final session of the conference. I hope you've all enjoyed the sessions with us, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.